Hello, thanks everyone for coming to my Countway Library Lunch and Learn on the history of the Warren Anatomical Museum and how it fits into the larger medical museum community. This is a revisiting of a talk that I gave in 2016 at the Congress of the the European Association of Museums of the History of the Medical Sciences in Groningen, the Netherlands. Please be advised that during this presentation, there are some slides that have pictures of human remains, such as this first one, in them. So if this is something that you do not want to see, then you should turn back now. So several years ago, to get a better understanding of the greater museum landscape, so that I could supply some context for the Warren Anatomical Museum, I began to build a census of historical medical museums in North America. This fed into a more recent project with pathologists Susan Lester, Julie Lemon, and James Wright to build a database of all the surviving historical specimen collections in North America, or United States and Canada, mostly to try to facilitate modern pathological research. Some 19th and 20th century figures actually were already engaged in this survey work. For example, John Shaw Billings identified 14 U.S. Anatomy and pathology museums in his medical museums with a special reference to the Army Medical Museum in Washington in 1883. In his report he wrote in 1883. Many of the institutions in this report from which this chart is actually taken, but many of the museums in this report are gone, but several survive. You'll see circled there at the top is the Warren Museum at Harvard University. Also circled is the Mutter Museum in Philadelphia, which is the most popular, probably the most popular surviving medical museum left in the United States. Towards the bottom of the chart for US is the Army Medical Museum, which is now the National Museum of Health and Medicine, which also survives. It's probably the largest of the surviving medical museums. Billings wasn't alone in some of this survey work. Another historical work that highlighted anatomy and pathology museums in the United States and Canada was Abram Flexner's 1910 Medical Education in the United States and Canada. And if you're not familiar with the Flexner report, that was an effort funded by the Carnegie Foundation to survey each medical school in Canada and the United States to assess its quality. The report had a significant impact on medical schools. Some medical schools closed because of the report, others merged together. But Flexner believed that medical museums were a critical part of medical education. To highlight that, I mean, that central quote there, the conclusive evidence of lack of an educational conscience or pride is the general absence of a decent medical museum. So in his criteria, Flexner saw a medical museum is critical, or integral rather, to a successful medical school. In Flexner's report, he identified 53 museums or noted specimen collections out of the 168 schools that he surveyed. So this again sort of builds on the census that I was trying to take of how many medical schools existed in the early sort of development of the American medical school, of how many medical museums existed in the development of the American medical school. I've also just noted a couple quotes of Flexner calling out museums in his report at certain medical schools. So, he said the Case Western Reserve University School was a museum in abundance. That institution is gone, but some of those collections survive. The University of Texas Medical Branch Galveston, he had thought very highly of. He said it was a large pathological museum, beautifully kept. Every specimen is classified, labeled, and indexed. And a notable anatomical museum, in which special preparations are most advantageously arranged for teaching use. And he would call these museums out repeatedly in his report. That collection in Galveston, Texas actually still exists, and there's a program being developed around it. So looking at these sources, and additionally looking for catalogs of museums, I came up with a sample of 61 medical museums that were existing between 1888 and 1911, of which the Warren Museum was sort of one of these 61. They're not all the same. Some were at major medical schools, some were at hospitals, some were private, some were sort of smaller, sort of emerging museums, some were sort of middle of the road museums. And so this chart just indicates that of these 61, it sort of gives you a breakdown of where these museums were. The Warren Museum would have been that large 26 chunk, the 17 chunk there of the 17 sort of major medical school museums. So within this landscape, the Warren is always reviewed quite favorably by these different sort of actors. Um, Billings called it the best museum connected with a medical school in this country. Uh, Flexner doesn't call on the Warren specifically, but when he's talking about the laboratories at Harvard Medical School, of which the Warren was a part of, Flexner said the laboratories are unexcelled in equipment and organization in respect to both teaching um, and research. So in both those areas, Flexner felt very highly, and so did Billings felt very highly of the museum at Harvard Medical School. And for Billings, this was the museum that he was talking about. This one right here. So this museum, this is a picture of the museum that Billings saw in 1910 when he was writing his report. This is what it looked like probably from about 1906 to about the 1960s. It was in Building A of Harvard Medical School. It's that which is now called Gordon Hall. It's the central building on campus. This whole was a whole new campus built in 1906. It was a new building in 1906 that was built specifically for the Warren Museum. And as you can see here, this is where that's where this building is located. It's in the center of the Harvard Medical School quad. The top 3 floors were built specifically for the museum. Also in that building in 1906 was the dean's office and the Harvard Medical Library. So it really became a sort of focal point of the school. And this was indicated during the dedication of the new campus in 1906. Thomas Dwight referred to the museum multiple times in his address on the laboratories at Harvard Medical School and the new campus, calling a great museum as a crown of a medical school. It's the chronicle of its progress. The museum continues for generation. Posterity shall read in it the record of the return that Harvard Medical School has at least tried to make. So you can tell in 1906, the museum was really peaking at Harvard Medical School, that it was a really integral part of Harvard Medical School's program. So that's not the Warren now, nor was it in the Warren in the beginning. So it's important to sort of let's see how the museum gets to that point in 1906, 1910s, 1920s, when 1930s, when it's really peaking at the medical school and sort of and in that very grand space. The museum was actually started in 1816, and it was started by this guy right here. This is John Collins Warren. John Collins Warren was the founder of the museum, but among other things, he was an incredibly important figure in terms of medical institution building in Boston and in Harvard. He was the Hersey Professor of Anatomy and Surgery at the medical school from 1815 to 1847. He actually took over for his father, John Warren, in that position. He was the medical school's first dean. He was the co-founder and senior surgeon at Massachusetts General Hospital. He did the first surgical demonstration using anesthesia in 1846. He was the founder of the museum. He was the co-advocate and a co-author of the Massachusetts Anatomy Act in 1831. He was the co-founder of the New England Journal of Medicine and Surgery and Collateral Branches of Science in 1811. And so it's pretty clear that Warren was a very sort of important fixture in terms of the medical community, and part of that legacy he does leave behind in the Warren Anatomical Museum. So as I mentioned, the Warren Museum started in 1816, and it actually starts in this building here. At that time, it was called the Museum of the Massachusetts Medical College. The reason why it was called Massachusetts Medical College at that time is because the state gave Harvard a large grant of money, and so the medical school was actually called the Massachusetts Medical College, but it's the same institution. It's Harvard Medical School. And so this Museum of the Massachusetts Medical College, which is the first iteration of the Warren Museum from 1816 to 1847, was essentially John Collins Warren's personal teaching collection. So this was a collection that Warren sort of acquired and grew and established from his own creation. So he's making preparations using cadavers at Harvard Medical School, but he is also purchasing overseas, particularly in France, particularly Paris. He's purchasing anatomical preparations and bringing them back and using them. So this is that first iteration of the Warren Anatomical Museum at Harvard Medical School, starting in 1816. This individual actually displayed on this slide is actually from that early collection. It's an individual with Pott's disease, or sort of a curvature of the spine created by tuberculosis. This individual is still in the Warren Museum's collection, and it was that they were brought to the Harvard Medical School by John Collins Warren, I believe from Paris. So it's another one of those individuals that came from overseas and used in teaching. The second location, sort of at Harvard Medical School, of the Warren Museum at Harvard Medical School, was at the North Grove Street location. So Harvard Medical School actually moves many times before it occupies its current space in the Longwood area of medical school of the Longwood area of Boston in 1906. And its second destination, or second, this isn't even its second, it's probably its third location actually. Um, excuse me, its fourth location was here at North Grove Street in 1847. It's actually was placed right next to Massachusetts General Hospital at the time, which was deliberate. And that was the War Museum had a very specific built space for it in that building from 1847 to 1883. And this is the only interior photograph we have of the War Museum existing in that space. Some later images of this space, but the War Museum had been relocated out of it at that time. There's a couple noted collections in here. One, you can see the phrenology collection, the Boston Phrenological Society collection, sort of lined up around the railing there around the museum. And this was its principal space in this sort of first phase. This is also the phase of the museum that takes place after John Collins Warren has retired. So John Collins Warren retires in 1847, and when he retires, they renamed the museum the Warren Anatomical Museum. So it was the Museum of the Massachusetts Medical College, but now it's called the Warren because John Collins Warren retired, gave his collection to Harvard Medical School, along with money to maintain it, and then it was named after him. So that's sort of the birth of the name. The Warren Anatomical Museum happens in 1847. It moves out of this space in 1833 to a location on Boylston Street, which is now where the BPL Annex is, or the Boston Public Library Annex. It occupied that space on Boylston Street from 1883 to 1906. We don't have any great interior shots of that museum space. So I won't be covering that in great detail. But this gives you an impression of what the museum looked like between 47 and 83. This is an individual that was actually prepared and created during that phase of the museum's life. So this is an anatomical preparation of head and neck around 1850. It was prepared by Richard Hodges, who is a professor at Harvard Medical School. One of Hodges' chief responsibility was creating preparations like this. So this would have been a locally sourced cadaver, so someone from the dissecting room most likely, and then the hot wax had been injected into their vessels and then dissected away to create a model that could be used to teach head and neck anatomy over and over and over again. And this individual also still is in the collection of the Warren Anatomical Museum and is actually available and often used for teaching still at the school. So also in this sort of second phase of the Warren Museum, starting in 1847, it gets its first non-Warren curator, right, non-Warren family member curator. So JBS Jackson becomes essentially the first curator of the Warren Anatomical Museum after John Collins Warren. JBS Jackson is, in addition to becoming the Warren Museum curator in 1847, becomes the professor of pathological anatomy or morbid anatomy at Harvard Medical School, making him the first full professor of pathology in the United States at that time. He is also the pathologist and a physician at Massachusetts General Hospital at this time, doing most of their autopsies. So he's doing a lot of their sort of exploratory and research work that's happening in the human body, and bringing that expertise to the college or to the medical school in his teaching and curatorship of the Warren Anatomical Museum. Jackson also at this time is the curator of two other museum cabinets that are occurring in Massachusetts or in Boston at this time. Massachusetts General Hospital had its own museum, had a small specimen collection. So there was an MGH museum that he was the curator of. And then there was the Boston Society for Medical Improvement, which had a pathological cabinet, and he was the curator of that cabinet too. He eventually brings both of those other Boston medical museums into the Warren Anatomical Museum. And so both of those collections still exist, but they exist within the Warren. JBS Jackson was a really important figure museologically. So in terms of medical museums, he's really important. And he was incredibly important to the Warren Museum's history because he takes John Collins Warren's collection, in addition to adding to it and augmenting it, he catalogs it and categorizes it. And so he takes the Warren Museum collection and creates divisions and series for its total collection, sort of organizing it by the human body both healthy human body and the morbid human body, or so the morbid meaning pathological or diseased human body, and creating different sections of the collection so that it could be better used for research and teaching. And then he publishes this organizational method in an 1870 descriptive catalog of the Warren Anatomical Museum, of which this is just the table of contents. You can see are part of the table of contents. And so he essentially takes that entire collection and creates a way that makes it more accessible for the user community. This is, I believe, just a healthy anatomy for the most part, these divisions, and then these are the divisions of pathological or morbid anatomy. And so he really takes it by, he's dividing both for the most part by anatomical part, and then getting further into the diseases into their individual entries. He's actually basing this on a work that he already did in 1847, 1848, when he made a descriptive catalog of the Anatomical Museum of the Boston Society for Medical Improvement. So the Boston Society was a physicians group. They had this private pathological cabinet, and Jackson was the curator of that. And so he published a catalog of that collection in 47. And it's mostly pathological anatomy, but the categorization is very similar to the categorization that he used in the Warren Museum in 1870. And so he's really thinking deeply about how to make sense of not just the collection, but use it to make sense of the human body and to make the diseases that are inflicted upon the human body. So it's very important if you're thinking about this period of the Warren Museum and then even the periods thereafter, that it's not sort of hodgepodge or a cabinet of curiosities. It's a really well-organized vehicle for use for anatomical and pathological understanding. This is actually a piece that came from the Boston Society for Medical Improvement. So as I said earlier, the Boston Society for Medical Improvement collection was absorbed into the Warren actually in the 1870s. It was about a 1,500 sort of case and specimen collection. This is a 7-fingered arm. It's actually called a mirror hand. Because the hand, there's a genetic or genital malformation that happens where the hand gets mirrored on the middle finger, and you end up with 3 middle fingers, 2 ring fingers, and 2 pinkies. And so that's a hand here that has had that malformation. This arm and hand are still in the Warren Museum's collection. And so, as I mentioned, there was that period that the museum moved to Boylston Street with the rest of the medical school between 1883 and 1906. But then in 1906, it's moved again. It's moved into that grand space in Building A at Harvard Medical School's current campus. The curator for the 1883 move and the 1906 move was a man named William Whitney, who was also a pathologist at MGH. And he stewarded the museum through those 2 very major moves and reclassifications and recategorizations and also sort of re-exhibiting. There's a lot of natural light in this space. I don't know if it's evident from the photograph, but there is a huge skylight. There's windows that are letting in light to each floor. There's actually windows in between the floors, letting light go all the way down. Might be hard to see here, but in the middle of the bottom floor, there's actually there's a table sitting there by himself. That's Phineas Gage. So even at that time in 1906, he has a very obvious place of prominence. And also there's busts all around the atrium there. Those busts are now in the Medical Education Center at Harvard Medical School. So if you're familiar with that space, it is those same busts. So we've gotten to 1906, and as I may have mentioned earlier, this space, the museum occupies this space really up into the 1960s in a very similar fashion of occupying these 3 floors. But starting in the 1960s, even starting in the 1950s, actually, and then progressing in the 1960s, this space begins to decrease for the museum as more of it gets put in storage. Most of it gets put in storage. Some of it gets transferred. And actually some of it gets decommissioned completely. And there are sort of a lot of reasons for this gradual sort of decrease in size. But here are a couple more pictures of the interior of the museum when it's still at its height in the 1910s and 20s and 30s and 40s and 50s. So mostly this seems to be some skulls cabinets. There's a fetal preparation actually in the lower left, and a Bauchine skull also in the lower left there. This is sort of a much more wider view of how it was arranged in that 1906 to 1950 space. And so what happens to the Warren Museum, sort of starting really in the 1960s, but as I said earlier, actually, it's really starting in the 1950s. And the decrease of the museum's function in space is really multifactorial. It's not just one thing. Probably the chief thing, though, is the gradual shift over the course of the 20th century from macroanatomy. So this is the shift in teaching and research in medical schools in general, from macroanatomy, so big body part anatomy, to microanatomy, so sort of histological studies. And so the tissue needs of a medical school changes very dramatically over the course of the 20th century. And that is largely, and then the Warren Museum and its decrease reflects that change, right? Because you no longer, the sort of emphasis on gross anatomy or big body part anatomy is shifting to sort of tissue science, cellular biology, genetics, protein science, all the things that we can sort of imagine that takes place in medical school today. And then that shift is very much reflected in the way that the departments are structured at Harvard Medical School. So in 1985, the Department of Anatomy becomes the Department of Anatomy and Cellular Biology. So it's a sort of rise of cellular biology. And then actually, eventually in 1993, the Department of Anatomy is removed and just becomes the Department of Cellular Biology. And it's really at that time that the Warren Museum itself actually loses its sort of administrative home at Harvard Medical School. Once the Department of Anatomy is gone at the end of the 20th century, the Warren Museum needs a new division to take it over because there's actually no more department that has a home in. There's a couple of other things that's important to keep in mind if you're thinking about the decrease of the Warren Museum, and I would argue the decrease of medical museums in general in the United States. They take up a lot of space, and there's a lot of space pressure on medical schools, or at least there was at Harvard Medical School and still is, to maximize your space usage. They take up a lot of room. There's very much of changing in the way we think about bioethics over the course of the 20th century, particularly in the post-World War II era. And that clearly affects how the medical school wants to manage human remains on its campus. And then also the Universal Whole Body Gift Act is passed in 1968. And that's the law that allows people to give their bodies to science, give their bodies for dissection, also governs tissue donation, organ donation. That again changes the way that the medical school is interacting with the human body. It's also cultivating donors of human remains. And all of those things are creating a sort of, maybe tension's too strong a word, but is creating a space for the Warren Museum to no longer have the same amount of utility that it once had. And so it decreases in size slowly over the latter half of the 20th century. The vast majority of it going in storage. And so what happens is that it gets taken over by the Countway Library of Medicine, and that happens in 1999. And so, as I'd mentioned, it's the department that was curatorially responsible for the Warren, the Department of Anatomy, essentially disappears by the end of the 20th century. And because of that, there needed to be a new home department. The Countway filled that role, so the library filled that role. And then the managing unit within the Countway Library is the Center for the History of Medicine. It takes over that function in 1999. It's still the curatorial unit. That's where me, as the curator, is located, is in the Center for the History of Medicine. The Center for the History of Medicine, in addition to the Warren, has the medical school's rare book collection, it has its archival collection, it has the manuscript collections of many sort of Harvard-affiliated faculty members and scientists, it has the Brigham and Women's Archives. Hospital Archives is also in the collection. So there's a lot of different programs within that Center for the History of Medicine of the Warren, of which the Warren is just one. And so since the Warren Museum has been placed in the center, a lot of exciting things have happened and sort of created a resurgence of sorts, very gradual but still impactful resurgence of the Warren Museum at medical school, and then also the larger sort of history of medicine community. And so I'm just going to go through a couple of really interesting things that have happened since my time as curator for the most part. So we furthered our compliance with the Native Americans Grave Repatriation and Protection Act, which is a federal requirement. We completed the inventories of 3,400 osteological preparations. And then part of that project embraced a new database system called the museum system. That's a really important part of our most recent museum functioning. We did a similar inventory project of the wet tissue collection of approximately 900 wet tissue specimens, and put those into the TMS database for the most part, and went through that entire collection. Again, getting these better, this like increasing the physical and intellectual understanding and control of the War Museum's collection. We've been loaning materials. So since 2012, there have been 2 preparations of injured sailors that were injured during the War of 1812 that have been on display at the U.S. Constitution Museum in Boston. We've done some larger, some more major loans. So we were part of a co-curated exhibit at the collection of historical scientific instruments at the Science Center at Harvard College, so in Cambridge. There's a very large exhibit that we put together called Body of Knowledge, of which the Warren loaned about 30 objects or 30 individuals or preparations. And that exhibit actually went on to win an award in the small exhibition category of the British Society for the History of Medicine. There's been mass digitization of certain Warren Museum materials, particularly 2D materials. So these are part of the Henry Jacob Bigelow and Oscar Wallace collection of watercolors that were used to teach at the school in the 1850s and 60s and 70s. And it was part of the Warren Museum's collection. And those can be found online in our online exhibit tool, OnView. And then the War Museum has maintained a gallery at the medical school in the Countway Library, on the top floor of the Countway Library, or the 5th floor of the Countway Library. That building is being renovated right now, so that gallery is actually closed, but we will reopen once the building is done finished with its renovation. And we do gallery programs in that museum space. There's some numbers there from fiscal year 13, we did 52 programs. Fiscal 14, we did about 40 programs. 15, we did about 53 programs. Those numbers actually have continued to progress. We're doing about 50 educational programs in the gallery a year for about 1,000 or so students. And so that's been an exciting growth area of the Warren Museum. We've also been doing smaller exhibits throughout campus. And so that we have a satellite exhibit space in the Clinical Skills Center. There's about 20 artifacts in the Clinical Skills Center at Harvard Medical School that all sort of centered around diagnostic medicine, because that's one of the principal diagnostic medicine teaching spaces at Harvard Medical School. There are about 20 artifacts from the historical object collection. So that's something I haven't mentioned before, but the Warren Museum has a large historical object collection, and that's mostly what the museum collects now is historical objects. We've been engaging with the student body and the faculty a little bit more directly with things like Anatomy Day, which we've been doing since 2015. And so at the end of the students' body block period, where they're actually doing human dissection, we take out historical materials, both from the museum's collection, but then the larger center's collection, and have been presenting those to students and faculty members with some success. Here's just some examples of wet specimens that we brought out when we were doing the inventory of that. And so that just gives you a sort of really broad overview of where the museum started, the landscape that it was part of at other medical museums, but then also some of the projects that have happened since it was brought into the Center for the History of Medicine. I hope this has been informative. The Warren Museum is sort of continuing to sort of grow and build, and it's going to be, I feel very confident it's going to be taken to some really interesting new places as it continues to sort of gradually resurge. I'm just ending with this quote, because this is a quote that how William Whitney thought about the museum, and I sort of have always liked it. Dr. Whitney aimed to have the museum simple, quiet, and dignified, as it represents human suffering, and he hoped in the study of the specimen alleviation of pain might be found. It was to him a sacred trust. He felt that the value of the museum was in its use. I like this quote for a lot of reasons, but one of the sort of main things I like about it is it really underscores the reason why the museum is and the larger Center for the History of Medicine is still at the medical school. It's at Harvard Medical School, because one of its main objectives is to use its historical collection, its historical resources, to inform and inspire modern medicine. And so it is not a resource that's supposed to be relegated to history, but something that is supposed to be used for our appreciation of science and to advance the modern medical mission of the school. So thank you very much. I hope this was informative. and I will take questions.